Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The biggest mystery surrounding the most notorious member of the Republican freshman class, George Santos of New York, is not actually what is his deal. Of course, that is a really fascinating question. But the more important one is, where did all the money come from? Remember, this is a man who appears to have lied about almost his entire resume. He claimed that he worked at the investment banks Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, that he graduated from New York University and Baruch College. At one point, claimed he went to prep school Horace Mann. None of that is true. And for much of his adult life, George Santos seems to have been under pretty significant financial strain. He's faced eviction twice, once in 2015 when his Queens landlord filed suit accusing Santos of owing $2,250 in unpaid rent. Again in 2017 when the landlord of his rent-stabilized apartment accused him of owing more than $10,000 in rent stretching over 5 months. Now, there's obviously zero shame in that. People have a hard time paying rent in New York. And Santos, by his own reporting, made a salary of $55,000 in 2019, and New York is an expensive place to live. But the weird part is that then, boom, all of a sudden, he reported making a salary of $750,000, earning between $1 and $5 million in dividends in both 2021 and 2022. This is all allegedly from his own company called the DeVolder Organization. George Santos then lent his congressional campaign more than $700,000. That's at least according to FEC filings. Now, he has never given any particularly persuasive or convincing account of how he made all this money. I mean, if a friend of yours showed up and they're like, I just got a new job that pays me $1 million a year, you'd be like, well, what's the job? Oh, you know, this and that. There are new facts coming to light about one job we know, though, that George Santos really did have. This one's confirmed, and that was at a Florida-based investment company called Harbor City Capital Corp. In July of 2020, Santos, who went by George DeVolder at the time, joined Harbor City as their New York regional director, where he, according to the press release, would work primarily with domestic and international family offices, institutional investors, and high net worth clientele. In a recently unsurfaced video from 2020, Santos bragged about the unbelievable returns he was getting for his investors.
Currently at Harbor City Capital, I manage a $1.5 billion fund, right? And I know how to manage it well. I give record returns to anybody who watches this. They'll understand I'm giving, a 12% fixed yield income return a year, which nobody in the market's giving 4, and we're giving 12. We're also giving up to 20 to 26% in IRR return on our investors' capital. So if there's something I know how to do is manage dollars and grow them.
Okay. Everyone's giving 4% fixed yields. I'm giving 12%. Well, that's a big difference. How you doing that? If that sounds like possibly not on the up and up, if it sounds like a Ponzi scheme, well, guess what? The SEC agreed. In April of 2021, the Securities and Exchange Commission filed a complaint against Harbor City, alleging that it was, and I quote here, an ongoing fraudulent Ponzi scheme victimizing hundreds of investors across the United States. According to the SEC, Harbor City and its founder raised more than $17.1 million through a series of unregistered fraudulent securities offerings and misappropriated approximately $4.48 million in investor funds. Now, I got to be clear, Santos was not named in the complaint. He says he was not aware of any wrongdoing. He left the company 1 month before the suit was filed. But again, this is basically the one detail about George Santos's work history that we actually know to be true, that is confirmed. He didn't work at Citigroup. He didn't work at Goldman Sachs. He did work for a company the SEC broke up because they said it was a Ponzi scheme. For his part, George Santos is still defending himself. He claims there's no reason for him to resign from Congress, even went on a podcast yesterday to explain his side of the story.
One of the principal critiques I've heard is that a lot of money was donated to your campaign by you, $700,000, I believe. Where did it come from?
Well, I'll tell you where it didn't come from. It didn't come from China, Ukraine, or Burisma. How about that?
Well, yeah, that is an answer. I mean, is there anything else you can say about the work you did that was the origin of those resources?
Look, I've worked my entire life. I've lived an honest life. I've never been accused, sued of any bad doing. So, it's the equity of my hard-working self, and I've invested inside of me. Like I said, it didn't come from Burisma. It didn't come from Ukraine, Russia, China, unlike some folks that we all know that get money from those sources.
It's the equity of my hardworking self that I've invested inside of me. Again, your friend shows up, says he's got a new job, he's making $1 million a year. You say, what are you doing? He says, oh, it's just the equity of my hardworking self that I've invested inside of me. Okay, granted, Congressman, the money didn't come from China, I guess, or Burisma, whatever. Where did it come from? And back to that podcast for a minute. You may have noticed that the interviewer looked familiar. That's because he is Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida, who is actually filling in for the actual host of that podcast, who would be Steve Bannon. Now, Bannon could not be there yesterday because he was in court in New York, where he has been charged with defrauding donors to an organization that claimed to want to build a wall at the southern border. It was called We Build the Wall. Bannon also faced federal charges for that same scheme. You might remember he was arrested by Postal Service agents on a yacht belonging to a Chinese billionaire. But President Trump pardoned Bannon on those charges during his very last final hours in office. So all of that brought us to this truly wild scene where you got two Republican congressmen, George Santos, elected after deceiving Republican voters, who just hired a former producer on Steve Bannon's podcast, and Matt Gaetz, who is the backup host for Steve Bannon's podcast because Steve Bannon himself is in court charged with ripping off gullible Republican voters. God, is that good? Perfect in every conceivable way. No notes, gentlemen. The more we learn about George Santos, the clearer it becomes. He is the absolute epitome of the person who succeeds in the MAGA ecosystem. In addition to fabricating almost all of his biography, this is a guy who could soon be facing actual criminal charges in Brazil, where authorities intend to revive a fraud case against him. In 2008, Santos allegedly spent nearly $700 using a stolen checkbook and a false name, and only evaded prosecution because police could not find him. Well, guess what? He's in the U.S. Capitol, Brazilian police. George Santos is also the guy, look at this photo. He's also the guy who showed up to new member orientation, not in 2022, in 2020, when he ran the first time, shows up new member orientation, hangs out with actual elected members of Congress because his race wasn't called yet, but then when it was, he lost by 12 points. But come on, credit where due. He knows what works. This is what works in the MAGA Republican Party. I mean, let's be clear. Is Donald Trump any different from George Santos? I mean, he's more successful at what he does. These are the kind of figures that this particular form of politics rewards. Now, there are other people in the Republican Party that are smart enough, and you don't have to be that smart, to understand this is not a particularly successful form of politics outside of MAGA world, right? The New York Times just reported that some Republicans actually urged Santos to drop out of the race after seeing the results of a routine background study on him in late 2021. This is one commissioned by his own campaign to sort of pre-vet himself. And when Santos disputed key findings and vowed to continue running, members of the campaign team quit. I'm out, George, if that's your name. There are also 8 Republican members of Congress, including 6 from Santos's home state of New York, now calling on him to resign. But party leaders like Speaker Kevin McCarthy are just offering up platitudes.
He's got a long way to go to earn trust. But the one thing I do know is you apply the Constitution equal to all Americans. The voters of his district have elected him. He is seated. He is part of the Republican conference. There are concerns with it, so he will go before ethics. If anything is found to be wrong, he will be held accountable exactly as anybody else in this body would be. That is the fair way to handle anything you go, and that's how I'll deal with any single issue that ever comes forward.
Now, McCarthy has to say that because, of course, he can't afford to lose George Santos's vote because, of course, he has a razor-thin majority. And we've already seen how precarious that is in the week-long historic debacle that was the speaker vote. And in some ways, that's the whole drama of the Republican Congress in a nutshell. And in fact, the Republican Party. The party continues to be captured by the MAGA movement. The MAGA movement is full of people who are grifters or utterly toxic to median voters, or both. So good luck, Kevin.